Sharon Selvaggio is with the Xerces Society. Tiny, inconspicuous, and unappreciated species hold our world together. On their behalf, Sharon, who's on the staff in the Xerces Pesticide Program, works to help people recognize the risks of pesticides and move away from pesticide reliance toward more prevention-based pest management. Sharon is a former biologist and refuge manager with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and before Xerces worked for several years with Northwest Center for Alternatives to Pesticides. So welcome, Sharon.
Thank you.
And we'll listen raptly to you.
Okay. Well, it's really a pleasure to be here. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen now. And thank you, Judy and Kirsten, for inviting me. We had a really wonderful talk a few weeks ago, and it seemed like this is a very just very engaged audience just from being in the meeting for a few minutes here, and a dedicated audience. So I'm really pleased to be here to make your acquaintance for this brief time, and to talk about something that I think a lot of us are interested in. So thanks again, and I'll just go ahead and get started. So I'm going to talk to you today about how we can work together to get reliably safe pollinator plants. This is really about working with your local nurseries and your large plant buyers in your area, which can include large landscaping, design and install companies, plant brokers, cities, campuses, departments of transportation, and so on, to assure that pollinator-safe plants are grown and provided. But before I dive into all of that, I'm just going to give you a little background about who we are. I, as Judy said, I'm with the Xerces Society for Invertebrate Conservation. We have been around working on behalf of invertebrates for about 50 years. We have this really interesting and sort of noble founder, Robert Michael Pyle, who was really a butterfly guy. And he named our organization after the Xerces blue butterfly shown here on the left, this beautiful little thing. It was actually the first butterfly documented to have gone extinct due to human development. So we're working to try to prevent that kind of thing happening to a lot of other insects and invertebrates. And so what we're all about is really protecting the life that sustains us, because we couldn't survive as people without the ecological services that invertebrates provide. And specifically, invertebrates are food for countless other animals. They also provide pollination services. They provide decomposition and nutrient recycling services. They purify water, and they provide natural pest control for free. So this slide shows 8 of the thousands and millions, I don't even know how many, quite honestly, but basically the bulk of known species are invertebrates, and they are wildly diverse, incredibly beautiful, and all playing one or more of these roles. So today, I'm going to talk about the opportunity that's in front of us, and I'm going to talk about whether the plants that we buy are safe for pollinators now. I'm going to jump into solutions, and then I'm going to talk about approaching your local nurseries. So the way I see this, we've really got an opportunity these days, a big one, because led by organizations such as yours and native plant advocates really across the country and really around the world, who have been pointing out the superior ecological value, the pest resistance, and the hardiness and climate resiliency of native plants, more and more organizations such as cities and campuses, neighborhoods, departments of transportation, restoration groups, etc., even landscaping companies, they're all heeding the call to restore native habitats in their communities. And as a result, the demand for local, native, and safe plants has never been higher. And we see through our Bee City USA and Bee Campus USA program, which some of you might be familiar with, we see pollinator habitat just taking off in cities and campuses across the country. These photos, the two on the left and the right, they give you a tiny taste of what's going on in bee cities in particular. But even beyond that, at the neighborhood level, community level, we see kids, adults, everyone getting excited about pollinator habitat restoration. And it's bringing joy, as you can see through these pictures, community and wonder that comes with this newfound appreciation. I call it newfound for native plants, flowers, and their pollinators. And honestly, I have to wonder sometimes why. Why is it that pollinators, which this is somewhat obscure, this set of creatures, in my view, well, how did they catch the imagination of so many people across the country, especially when bees frighten so many people, including my own son, who's always trying to tell me that the work that I do is worthless. But well, misguided. Probably I should say misguided, because he'd rather that nobody save the bees, but it's sort of a joke between us. But the key, I really think, is about mutualism. I think pollinators give us hope for something that, we don't talk a whole lot about, but I think we all kind of long for, which is this sense of mutualism and connection between ourselves and other creatures on this planet. And because we can see the mutualistic relationship between bees and flowers, it's sort of a iconic or symbol, I think, of something that we all on some level are wanting to participate in ourselves. So this is about give and take that results in benefits on both sides. So this is why I think this is taking off. And maybe that is completely beside the point, but I think it's a helpful thing for me, at least, to think about, because it kind of goes beyond just the pure, the sort of transactional piece of it. So anyway, what is needed for this work of restoring pollinator habitats, of restoring native habitats? Well, besides motivated volunteers, which it does take a lot of, what's needed is a robust supply of pollinator-safe plants. So I've used that phrase a few times. And when I talk about pollinator-safe, what I mean is plants that are free from pesticide residues that are harmful to pollinators. You could define it much more broadly than that, but that's specifically what I'm talking about when I use that term. And when people purchase plants to create habitat within parks, within the public spaces in their cities, within their own gardens, this is part of the process for creating pollinator habitat. And this purchasing process creates an opportunity, especially large buyers and those that collaborate with other buyers and make themselves into a large buyer, even if they start out small. They can leverage their joint purchasing power when procuring plants by using a contract grow procedure. And by using this, we can all work together to assure that the plants are safe for pollinators when they're delivered. So I'll discuss the mechanisms of that in a minute, but first let's look at why this might be a good idea for pollinators. Pesticides are considered one of the leading threats to pollinators, along with habitat loss, climate change, and diseases and invasives, based upon a global review of 73 studies. Of all pollutants, pesticides are the most commonly cited in these 73 studies. And within the United States, a billion pounds, I'll just repeat that, of pesticides are applied each year in the United States. This is pesticides going on everything from agricultural lands to home landscapes, parks, natural areas, roadsides, railways, and more. So this comprises a huge stressor to insects and other invertebrates that we really need to be paying attention to. So pollinators, of course, they gather their food from leaves and from flowers. And in doing so, they can uptake pesticides by getting sprayed directly if they happen to be out and about when the pesticide is being applied. And they also can contact residues after a spray through touching the surfaces of plants that were sprayed recently. They can consume pesticides by consuming the tissue, such as pollen that may have residue on it, or leaf tissue that may have residue on it, or nectar that may contain residue that is inside the plant. And they can even consume contaminated prey. An example of this is hoverfly, which is a insect that both pollinates and also consumes pest insects. So it plays two roles. That it has a pest management role and also has pollinator role. And when it's working, when it's in its pest management role, when it has that hat on, so to speak, it can consume contaminated prey that are contaminated because they're feeding on plant tissue that actually has pesticide residue in it. So these are sort of the key, mechanisms of exposure, routes of exposure that pollinators, by which they can uptake pesticides. There are others. And when we buy plants, we can protect them from pesticides in our own garden by not using pesticides. We can also protect pollinators that are visiting our plants from being sprayed directly or contacting the residues topically in our own garden. But we can't protect them from consuming residues that are already in or on the plants that we've just purchased, unless we take steps to assure that we start out with pollinator-safe plants. And because most commercial nurseries and greenhouses do use pesticides on the plants that they produce, and this can include insecticides, fungicides, and herbicides, it takes special care to ensure that those residues are not still in or on the plants at residue levels that can be harmful. So an important question to ask is, are plants in the commercial marketplace safe now? And unfortunately, studies do show that we really cannot assume that they are. There haven't been too many studies, but from the ones that we do have available on nursery plants, we see that typically nursery plants contain quite a lot of residues, usually multiple insecticides and fungicides and herbicides. And sometimes the residue loads are at levels high enough to kill bees. If there are systemic pesticides inside the plant, these are the kind of pesticides that are absorbed by plants and then they move inside the plant. They can result in residues that are available in leaf or nectar later or in pollen later, and sometimes a long time after they've actually been applied. And in particular, woody plants, they can hold on to pesticide residues for months to years after an application. One of my coworkers just gave me a study that showed that horse chestnuts still had detectable residues 14 years after an application of a systemic pesticide. So this was the longest I had ever seen. I've seen quite a number of other studies with like 1 year, 3 years, 6 years. So we were aware of that, that those types of time spans, but even 14 years after an application, which is pretty mind-blowing. But what about pollinator plants that are grown especially to support bees or highlighted species like monarch? Can we count on these to be safe now? Before I jump into that, I just want to talk a little bit about some of the factors that leads to pesticide use and residues on nursery plants. And don't get me wrong, because I am not at all trying to paint nursery growers as insensitive to biodiversity concerns. I've talked to dozens of different nursery growers, and we work with a lot of nursery growers as an organization because we buy a lot of plants and give them away through a habitat kit program. But so in talking to growers and looking at a number of studies that have been done on the nursery industry, I've learned a little bit about why it's hard for nurseries to go without pesticides. And some of the factors that are listed here are some of the root causes or factors that do result in widespread use. First of all, a lot of plants are started in greenhouses, sometimes finished in greenhouses, and greenhouse conditions are just sort of ripe for pest outbreaks because of the humidity, the warmth and all of that. Things can go from 0 to 60 in very little time. And so that's just kind of goes with the conditions there. And we all want to buy a beautiful plant when we buy plants. And so nursery growers have a rational concern that their sales can be affected if there's plant damage or if a buyer might see insects on the plants. They call this, the cosmetic standard. Pesticides happen to be relatively cheap compared to labor. There was a study that looked at sort of like the relative allocation of budget across nurseries, and pesticides only comprised about 2% of the budget versus labor comprising 26% of the budget. This was a fairly recent study. So this is something to keep in mind as well. The states all, I believe, and the federal government also have plant health regulations that are well intended. They're aimed at curbing the spread of invasive and damaging pests, whether they be diseases, weeds, insects, across state lines generally. And so nurseries are regulated under that and can be inspected. And they are understandably averse to having a shipment stopped, which is something that can happen if an inspector comes in and sees some kind of insect that they're worried about crossing state lines. So this is another reason why pesticides can be used quite well at nurseries. Another factor is that nurseries can use, actually, for some chemicals at least, much higher rates per plant than what's allowed in food crops. And so these residues can show up at higher levels. And I think that this is because our regulatory system is kind of aimed at keeping us safe and is only kind of starting to grapple with our responsibility to also keep pollinators and other insects safe, but it's still the case that nurseries have this ability to use higher rates per plant. And then finally, there is, a lot of difficulty dialoguing with nurseries. Having done a lot of this, like I understand, it takes time. It can take some relationship building. It takes some awareness of how the industry works. And sometimes it's easier to just go buy a plant. And then we don't have good labeling rules, and only the state of California actually requires reporting from pesticide users. And we can get some kind of understanding about what nurseries are using when we look at the California reporting rules, but it's very difficult to get that kind of information when you're out there looking at just a beautiful plant tag that's telling you how great this plant is. So let me go to what we have learned recently about pesticides and milkweed, which are obviously a highlighted plant of great value to monarchs. We examined this question in 2022. We teamed up with researchers at the University of Nevada to look specifically at leaf pesticide residue on milkweed plants. They are the obligatory host plant for monarchs. That's the only plant that monarchs will lay their eggs on, with, I think, one exception. I think it's called the fringe tree. Excuse me, because I'm more of a toxicology person, and I might get a few of my little facts mixed up here. But so anyway, we looked at milkweeds, and we gathered 235 milkweed plants from across the country within sort of the main flyway areas for the monarch. And we detected 61 different pesticides in those 235 plants. That was 24 insecticides, 26 fungicides, 10 herbicides, and one chemical that's basically there to synergize. It's kind of basically to make the other pesticides work better. That was commonly found. And so of the plants, we looked at the average frequency and the range of, like, the number of pesticides each plant contained. And we found an average of 12 pesticides per plant, but the range was as low as 2 up to 28. And interestingly, a number of these plants had what we called wildlife tags, kind of touting their value to monarchs or to pollinators more broadly, because milkweeds are used by a wide variety of bees as well. And unfortunately, the plants containing the wildlife tags were even more likely to contain fungicides at toxic levels. Looks like I've got a little typo in there. So this was concerning to us because we were wondering, what did this mean for monarchs? But unfortunately, the literature on how pesticides affect monarchs is very slim. So the toxic effects to monarchs from these 61 different pesticides at the concentrations that we were finding is mostly unknown. But so we had data on 9 of the 61 pesticides. And so we were able to look at those chemicals only in terms of their actual effect on monarchs. However, because we had so many different pesticides showing up in these milkweed plants, the sheer number of chemicals raised questions about whether these chemicals were interacting, which some chemicals do, which can sometimes cause higher toxic effects than if these chemicals showed up by themselves. This is known as synergy or multiplied effect, and this has been seen with certain groups of pesticides. So as I mentioned, milkweed with wildlife tags, they were twice as likely to contain fungicides at toxic levels. A few fungicides were a couple of the 9 chemicals that we actually had data on for toxicity to monarchs. And we found that 38% of all of the plants that we gathered had concentrations of fungicides that were associated with shorter wing lengths in adult monarchs. And this is concerning because the wing length has been correlated with migratory ability in monarchs, and monarchs are famously a migratory species. So finding fungicides at levels that reduces wing length raised concern. Fungicides have been associated with negative effects on pollinators in other studies. Previous studies have found associations between fungicides and reduced larval survival, lower pupal weight, and reduced adult longevity. And fungicides can also inhibit insecticide detoxification. So there are multiple effects that are associated with fungicides sort of in general on pollinators, but specifically for monarchs. We found that if caterpillars ingest them during the caterpillar stage, it can result in basically a smaller wing size when they pupate into the adult stage. So we also found many insecticides at levels that we would consider high if we were looking at a plant tissue that bees would ingest. Obviously, bees are not directly consuming leaf tissue, so we can't really, conclude anything from that, but it was concerning. So all of this is sort of a reminder that no matter what kind of plant we buy, whether it's a native plant that we know has wildlife value, or whether it's an ornamental that we are buying at a nursery that may have some pollinator visitation, marketing information doesn't give consumers a full picture. So we ask that consumers be aware, talking to their nurseries, and not solely relying on labels, which remain unregulated. Most of you have probably heard about the issue of neonicotinoids or neonics. These are a group of very highly toxic insecticides that have been associated with some big bee kills. And some people ascribe pollinator decline partly to neonics, their widespread adoption since 1994 when they were first released. They are the most used group of insecticides in the US. And about 8-10 years ago, some of the big plant retailers, Home Depot, Lowe's, and a few other large retailers asked their growers to grow the plants that these retailers bought from them to grow neonic free. Because people were starting to recognize, hey, I want to get pollinator-safe plants because we're starting to see that this is important. If I'm going to go, to the trouble of establishing a pollinator garden, I want to make sure that the plants that I'm buying don't have residues that are toxic enough to kill them. And so the good news is that, we saw retailers starting to put some pressure on their growers. However, we are seeing that from a nursery producer survey that was conducted about 5 years ago, 166 responses in 49 states, only 13% of the growers had never used neonics, and about half of the producers had used neonics within the previous year. About 28% reported using neonics monthly or more often. And some growers had switched during, sometime in the recent past from neonics to other insecticides, and others hadn't. We saw that 2 of the neonics, imidacloprid and dinotefuran, they were more used than other neonics, and mostly the growers were applying them by foliar, which means that they were spraying the plant when it was leafed out. But soil application was also very common, which means that basically it gets watered in, absorbed through the roots, and can be absorbed by the plant a little bit more easily than if it is applied to the leaves. It's those soil applications that we're a little bit more concerned about, because those are the residues that can stay in the plants for a long time, usually at a lower level, but for a longer time. I talked a little bit, and I don't know how easily you can see both of these graphs here, but that some growers had switched to other insecticides. So this graph here on the left is basically from California. You might remember I said that in California we have reporting rules, and you could see that imidacloprid, which is in this black line here, and is one of the most used insecticides by nursery growers, it has undergone a decline from between 2013 and 2018, declining from about 7,000 applications down to about 4,500 or so during that time. Dinotefuran, which is the second, had remained fairly level. But what's this light blue line that we see is kind of accelerating upwards here? That is a substitute chemical called cyantroniloprol, something that we're worried about because it has a lot of the same traits as neonics. It's highly toxic. It is long-lived in plants. It can stick around for a long time, and it's systemic, which means it gets inside the tissue and can stay there. We also see this one in red at the bottom, also rising, flupirodifurone. Again, same properties, systemic, long-lived, highly toxic. So we're a little concerned that growers are saying, oh, we're not going to use neonics anymore. We'll just use these other chemicals, and they think that they're safe, but they're not necessarily safe. And this one on the right, this graph, kind of hard to read, but you can see the different chemicals. I can't even read it on my screen right now, so I'm not going to go through those names. But there's quite a lot of different systemic insecticides that are in use and that growers are adopting as the concern about neonics has become more broadly known. So what is the solution? Well, at Xerces, we're committed to sourcing plants that are safer for pollinators. As I said, we have this big habitat kit program. We buy thousands and thousands of plants. We give them away in habitat kit programs across the country. And we know that it takes some work to do this. So I want to share with you now how we do that. So goes without saying practically, but first, of course, focus on finding plants native to your local area from a local nursery who specializes in native plants. While you can't assume that a native plant grower is completely avoiding harmful pesticides, I have found through my many conversations with native plant growers that there are many out there who are very careful about their pest management practices and their pesticide choices. But it's still important to take steps to better understand their practices through a conversation. So we believe in vetting the nurseries that you buy from. And at Xerces, we do that by requesting a conversation from each of the nurseries that we source from. I call them up, ask about their pest management practices and their pesticide uses. And we focus on these 3 topics. First, how do they prevent pests and diseases? What kind of non-chemical management techniques do they use? Things like the timing of when they seed the plants, how they manage moisture and ventilation, whether they have some kind of conservation biocontrol mechanism in place where they're allowing native predators and parasitoids to do some of the pest management work, and they've got habitat for that, so on. There's all kinds of prevention techniques. It's very interesting to talk to nurseries about these. So we ask about that, and especially how they use prevention for the key pests that they have. Also, do they monitor their pest pressure? How often are they looking at their plants? Are they quantifying what they see? If they do they keep records of that? Do they hold off on applying pesticides until they've sort of reached a certain threshold? All of these things are part of monitoring and decision making. And finally, when they use pesticides, as most of them do to some degree, at least some of the time, how do they make choices about which pesticides they use? When do they use pesticides? How are they applying? Are they applying, to an entire house, an entire greenhouse? Are they applying to an entire block? And so on. So these are some of the kinds of questions that we ask. And we recommend that others do this too. And we know that these can be somewhat difficult conversations to navigate, partly because it takes some practice to do this, partly it takes some self-education. And pesticides can be controversial and people can be uncomfortable. Pesticides have these weird chemical names that can be kind of hard to pronounce. And, learning about nursery practices can be, take a little bit of a learning curve. But at Xerces, we are settled that we're committed to having these advanced interviews with all the nurseries we work with, whether we engage in a contract grow or just buy plants off the shelf. And that allows us to better understand their practices. And we use that as a factor in deciding who we're going to buy from. We outline this basic approach in these 2 fact sheets, which are online at our website, so that any buyer can undertake a similar process. And these are sort of slightly different audiences, these 2 fact sheets. On the right, it's intended more for nurseries offering Be Safe plants, but also for large buyers. And the buying Be Safe plants is really useful for sort of the home gardener, the more casual buyer. So I encourage you to go take a look at these, and if you have any questions, get back to me, and hopefully these will be helpful. So let's talk about a contract grow, because this is a further step that people can take especially when buying a known number of quite a lot of plants. A contract grow is a service. This is a definition here from Specialty Trees. It's offered by many production nurseries, and it essentially allows people to reserve that plant material, sometime before it's required, so the nurseries can get started on growing it. Sometimes they have to go out and source the seed. They get things germinated and so on. So you specify what you want, put down a deposit, you've locked in the pricing. But the key thing here is that the material is grown and nurtured to your required specifications and supplied when it's ready and when you need it. And this is a way to get assurance upfront that you can get the kinds of plants that you want grown the way you want. In a contract grow, the nursery is usually starting the plants from scratch for you. So since we're looking for reliably safe plants, when we do contract grows, we're looking to have finished plants that are free of pesticide residues that could result in harm for pollinators. It's not an absolute standard. It doesn't mean that every plant is expected to be grown pesticide free, or that every plant will contain absolutely no residues. We do expect that plants will have some residues because of the way in which we've structured this. But it does allow us to be reasonably certain that the most concerning pesticides will be absent from our contract grown plants when we pick them up, or present at low levels only for pesticides that we're pretty confident will decline more quickly. In developing the list of the most concerning pesticides, we thought about those that are most toxic to bees and to butterflies and moths, and about the pesticides that could be more long-lived or persistent in or on plants. So specifically, our procurement policy specifies that when we engage in a contract grow, we want the plants to be protective for adult and larval bees, because it's not just enough to protect the adults who are actually collecting the pollen for the offspring, and then adult butterflies and their caterpillars, because caterpillars, depending upon the species, might be out there at any time, and we want to protect all the life stages. And the specific provisions are that some pesticides are not allowed on the plants or the soil, or to be applied through chemigation throughout the growing period. And some pesticides are not allowed 2 weeks before we take possession of the plants. And specifically, we disallow the use of 26 systemic insecticides throughout the production cycle. And we disallow the use of several dozen other pesticides, which includes a number of different insecticides and some fungicides. Mostly these are contact type, not systemic, for 2 weeks prior to delivery. So this eliminates the higher risk pesticides of concern and increases the safety of the plants at the time that we take possession. And taken together with the results of our interview with the nursery, which helps us assess the nursery's prevention and monitoring practices, together these steps help us support ecologically sound production. And we have a number of nurseries that have adopted these contract grow specifications, so it's working. Not, every nursery is interested in this, but quite a few are so far. So we are starting to see that this is something that nurseries will agree to if there is a market. And if, especially, we're finding that it's often very aligned with the native plant growers that we're approaching. But it's necessary to sort of work out the details in advance. So let's talk about approaching your nurseries. And, I'm not exactly sure who's in the audience. I'm assuming it's not a lot of like big plant growers, although there might be a few of big plant growers, buyers in the audience. But those of you here probably know some of your local nurseries pretty well. You may also know who's putting in habitat in your local area, and who are those large landscapers in your community, or restoration organizations, or municipalities that are doing a lot of habitat plantings. And so if you'd like to make a difference locally at a larger scale, we encourage you to think about those large buyers in your community and talk with them about adopting this approach in their purchasing. And from our own experience, we know that adopting this approach takes some thought, it takes some planning, it also takes a little bit of interpersonal skill as well. So let's go through some of these steps. First, identify those nurseries that are producing the plants that you already want. Those native plant nurseries in your area. What's your previous experience with them? Who owns the nursery? What are their attitudes toward pollinator conservation and pest management? What's their base knowledge level? Then it's always helpful to educate yourself on common nursery challenges and practices. Some of the stuff that I went over earlier, it just helps to go in like as an ally with the nursery, working together with them rather than, kind of in opposition to them. And then interviewing the lead grower or the integrated pest management lead to better understand the general pest management practices is the first third actually on this list, but a really important step. And if they seem like a good candidate, you can share the contract growth specifications by email. You can allow time for the nursery to review the specifications then against the current practices, and they may want to take a few weeks or a month to look at this and really think it through. If you haven't heard back in a couple weeks, follow through, and you can consider variances. I always tell the nurseries that I'm talking to that this is not rigid, that it is, what I'm sharing is a template that we're open to variances if they need a few changes. And sometimes we have found that nurseries can, say, well, that particular plant, I just can't grow without that pesticide. So I can do this for everything else, but I just won't grow that plant for you guys. Or they might say, you know what, I'm willing to try a different method here. I'm going to try doing it differently than I have in the past. We've seen some of our growers do that. So it's helpful to be flexible and talk it through with them. And then finally, once everybody's come to agreement, sign a contract. And make it worth their while. You know, you may find that some nurseries, as we have found, that they're eager to go this route and they don't have any conflict with their existing practices, but others may be more hesitant. They may be worried that, you know, this is going to lock them into something, or it's just going to be too difficult. One way that you can help make it worth their while is to collaborate with other large buyers. You know, you can quantify your reach. And perhaps maybe you've got an ongoing program in the city. For instance, maybe you represent the city and every year they buy 5,000 plants. Maybe that can be coupled with another municipality that is buying 2,000 plants and so on. If you've got kind of an ongoing plant purchasing program, that could be very attractive to some of these nurseries, and they may be willing to make the changes. Another, so that creates a lot of leverage. Another way is to recognize the nursery for their efforts in sustainability. This is, you know, something that I think nurseries can really respond to. You can consider preferred vendor status for some of the nurseries. And finally, you can provide resources and information about why this is important. I will say that for Xerces, we're a nonprofit organization. We get funding through a lot of different foundations, from different governmental entities and so on. And our own policy has a non-endorsement section, so we can't, you know, I'm suggesting here to endorse or recognize the nursery for their efforts in sustainability. We don't do endorsements, basically because of our funding, so we need to be careful about that. However, people are often willing to work with us because they know that we have some influence. So anyway, these are just different ideas about how to make it worth their while. And that really concludes my presentation. And if you think you're interested in going this route or you have some questions about it, I'm happy to take any questions, and you can reach out to me afterwards, and we can talk in more detail about our process. I want to say thanks to all of our supporters. We have, as I said, so many different people who help support us, tons of individuals, and then a lot of different businesses, or governmental organizations, private foundations, scientists, and so on. And I just want to say thank you again to Judy and Kirsten for initiating this conversation and inviting me here. It's really great to talk to all of you today. And I will just conclude by saying you can join our movement if you like. The work that we do does depend on everyone. So if you want to become a member, there's a link there. And thank you so much. There's my email address. If you've got any questions afterwards, feel free to contact me. And I'll stop sharing.
Thank you very much. That was very interesting, Sharon.
If you do have a question that you want to just ask, you can just raise your hand. I see we already have one from Mike Littman. So I'm going to ask you to unmute now, and you can go ahead and ask that question.
Yeah, hi. Thanks for the presentation, Sharon. That was great. Just a question. I'm always interested in these things because I work with extension offices and Blue Ridge prisms, I should say. And some are comfortable putting out lists of certified, let's say in the case of Prism, companies that they have identified as being good for removing invasives, for example. Whereas a lot of them think you cut down a tree of heaven, that's how you get rid of it, right? Not good. So I'm surprised with so many sponsors I just saw, and with all the research you did, that you wouldn't want to put out a list of nurseries that you don't necessarily endorse, but you've in some way certified or said, yeah, these guys are doing it the right way. So I'm kind of curious about that.
Yeah, we have been in discussions about that for a while now. I think where we've coalesced, and I'm hesitating only because we are still kind of at a beginning stage of this, but we thought about doing something more loose, like a pledge. But we have a program called Be Better Certified, which we've had in place for about 7 or 8 years. And that program has some very specific standards, and it is a third-party certification system, kind of like organic is. We set it up that way. It was really designed for agricultural crops, and nurseries are a little bit of a different animal, partly because most nurseries are growing many, many species. It can be more complicated with pest management because different species have different pests, they respond differently. And we decided not to do something like a pledge or a self-certification kind of system, that we remained more comfortable with having like a third-party certification system. So we have discussed and are sort of very slowly moving towards a certification system for nurseries, but it's not like on the cusp of being released by any means. It's still going to take some time. We do hope to get to that point, but we're just not there yet. And what that will mean is that we will be setting very specific standards, and the records of the nursery will be basically examined by a third-party certifier like organic is, and it won't be based solely on the conversation that it's falling to me primarily to have with nurseries. So as beneficial as those are, we wanted to have a more robust system in place. So does that make sense?
Sorry.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you. That makes sense. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mike.
All right, Liz McDowell, if you could unmute.
Hi, I'm just curious, do you have any kind of information on the impact of deer and rabbit repellents on insects, especially caterpillars? Whether those repellents are quote unquote organic or natural? Has anybody done any kind of research on that? Thank you.
That is not an area that I've really spent a lot of time looking. I will say that some of the organic pesticides, like that are, botanical type extracts and things, they're often exempt from the same kind of more rigorous pesticide testing that a synthetic pesticide has to go through with EPA. So what we find is that there might be some information that's available, but a lot of times those are exempt. And so we don't have a ton of information about it. Usually if there is some information, those are not seen to be particularly long-lived. But as with anything, it's helpful to just be aware that there might be an effect, at least a temporary effect. But if you want more information on that in particular, I can look some things up and get back to you. You said deer repellents, and what other kind of repellents did you mention?
Things like deer repellents, mainly deer repellents, but I know there are also people will spray rabbit repellents.
Oh, yeah.
And so yeah, that would be terrific if you could provide any kind of information. I've not been successful finding anything about it, and I'm very curious.
Yeah, I'd be happy to do that. Will you send me an email, Liz?
Sure.
So I know who to send an answer to. That would be
Certainly.
okay. Thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And Sharon, it would be great, this is Judy, if you could copy us on that also, because I
Sure.
think there would be a great deal of interest in that since we have such a huge deer population.
Okay.
Vaughn, did you still have a question? You had your hand raised a little while ago.
I just would like to know from Sharon, if there's an organic certification, and Maryland does have that, the USDA's got that in a way, and you're saying only California labels that they have pesticide free, and they label what was used. If it's not, I don't know exactly what that looks like. It looks very specific. Is organic a good way to start if a grower says they're organic? That's
Okay.
the question. Like,
Yeah, let me just go back. California doesn't label nursery plants any different. They don't have laws requiring labeling that's any different. What they do have is reporting rules for anybody that is basically like not a homeowner. They have to report to the state about their pesticide use. So for a wide range of different crops and urban uses, like all the pest control companies that do urban type pest control, all of that information has to be reported to the state. And so it allows us and people who study that to get some information about, you know, what's being used for which crops. The labeling and your question about organic, we do in our Be Safe plants. We recommend that people choose organic if they can for plants. There's two problems with it, though. This is not a perfect solution either. Even though we do put that in our fact sheet. The two problems are some organic pesticides still can be quite toxic to pollinators. Organic pesticides, which are derived from natural substances, they tend not to be as long-lived. And so if you're bringing a plant home and if something's been applied, it's probably going to break down fairly quickly. And one of the concerns that we have about some of the pesticides that are on the market is how long they last in plant tissue. And so that is an advantage for organically grown plants. But the other problem is that there are very few organically grown nursery plants that are certified because most nursery growers really need to have synthetic fertilizers. Just growing things in pots and the fast growth that they're looking for and often need, it's just not apparently, very useful for them to use organic fertilizers. And so I've talked to a number of growers about this, nursery growers, and they're like, we just couldn't do it without synthetic fertilizers. And right now, synthetic fertilizers are not allowed under organic labeling.
Alex, if you want to unmute.
Hi, yes, thanks. I have a question about using fungicide for residential use for like fruit trees, peach and apricot. Is there any kind of recommendations that you would use? Would you suggest not using them, or because fruit trees have they're particular, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm interested to hear your thoughts about that.
Yeah, I don't really want to advise on a particular case just because I'm not a pest control advisor myself, and I am reluctant to, since I don't grow fruit trees myself and I'm not a specialist in that. But I think just going back to the basic principles, we always try to encourage people to use those prevention and monitoring steps first. And so if there are things that you can do, spacing or cultural methods that can help keep the plants healthier, soil amendments, like, pruning, etc. I don't know, because I don't know exactly what kind of fruit trees you're growing. But we always, encourage people to try to use those prevention steps. And with monitoring, it's just about keeping an eye on the plants and using early interventions. So hopefully, if you do have a problem arising, that you catch it early. And sometimes that is, when you can actually most effectively attack the problem, whether it's a homegrown type, remedy that, or whether it's using some type of fungicide on only a portion of the plant if need be, But so I don't have specific responses for you. I'm sorry about that, but just those basic principles. Yeah.
Sandy, if you want to unmute.
I work for Maryland National Capital Park and Planning at a nature center. And when I became full-time, I got a pesticide license because I wanted to know what was safe to use on herbs in my garden. And I had it for almost 30 years. And basically, we had to go for training every year. We had standards we had to keep. I was in charge of reviewing the reports, and every 2 years they came, and they always asked me where I kept my Roundup. And I said, well, it's over at the maintenance yard, and when I need it, I get a small amount and I put it in a plastic container, you know, the bottle and it's tight and everything like that. My problem is when I go to Home Depot or Lowe's, they have pallets of Roundup in gallon containers. Those people can't use that much unless they've got a farm or something like that. But if they got a farm, they don't want to contaminate the environment. And it used to be when you went into Home Depot or Lowe's, they had a big fat book. So you could look up a disease or a pest and you could see what was recommended. And most of the time they had somebody there that knew something about the pesticides. Whenever I go to Lowe's, I end up trying to convince them that they don't need the gallon because they're going to have to get rid of it at some point, and it's not safe to have, you know, at home, and that there are easier ways to deal with things. But the problem is when I asked Lowe's why they had 50 gallons of Roundup sitting there on pallets and not saying, you know, this might be toxic to you, or there are state requirements for you to be able to spray in that. And the guy said, well, we can only do what our home office does. We don't order it, they just send it to us. And it just floors me that I guess they assume everybody's gonna rock around with a phone, smartphone, and look up the pesticide and see which one's best. I mean, there's nobody supervising. They need to have that person there that knows what's going on to be allowed to just put it out, you know, and leave it for somebody. You know, there are no forms or booklets or anything that's educating the public. They just know the advertisement on the TV says just spray a little Roundup and it'll kill it. So
Yeah, those advertisements on TV are pretty powerful. Like anyway, there's so much, you know, kind of like subliminal messaging, I think, in some of those advertisements. You know, it's about power over nature and it's about getting the job done and going back to the fun thing that you had planned for the weekend, you know. But yeah, that's why we have 1 billion pounds of pesticides being applied every year in the United States. And it's not only on ag lands. So ag lands take 80% of that, but the other 20% is mainly applied in urban areas by a lot of people who are, you know, some of them are licensed pest control, licensed pesticide applicators like yourself. But you know, a lot of them are homeowners who don't really maybe know the risks, but it's so culturally embedded that that's the society we live in. So anyway, I'm really glad that you all are thinking about this, that there's audiences out there who do care and are willing to maybe, you know, do things a little bit differently.
Martin Parks, you asked quite a few questions in the chat. I'm wondering if you're willing to ask any of them by unmuting.
Many of the parks and large areas are overtaken with lesser celandine. And when you look it up, the recommendation is always to use Roundup. So I didn't know whether you had any thoughts about that. Whether there are alternative ways of treating it.
Yeah, lesser celandine, that's a tough one. We have it out here too. By the way, I'm a West Coaster, but I used to go to the Washington, D.C. area a couple of times a year, and I have a niece who lives in Baltimore, so it was always a pleasure to
great.
go there. But I'm not out there much anymore, and I did see a picture of lesser celandine in Maryland, and I thought, oh man, they've
Oh,
got it too.
it's horrendous. Yeah, it's really
Yeah.
horrendous. Yeah. So,
Um,
like if a person wants to get rid of it in their garden, even.
yeah. We, I will say that Xerces policy, what we know about herbicides is that they can, have some harmful effects some of the time. There's definitely some harmful effects associated with Roundup for bees.
Like cancer.
Yeah, and then there's the human effects, especially if there's a lot of occupational exposure,
Right.
And we also recognize that they're probably not as harmful overall for pollinators as insecticides or fungicides. And so we try to give people information and let people make the decisions for themselves about what to do, and recognize that there's probably less risk in general for herbicides. For when you've got invasive species, again, just like anything else, if there's a way that you can dig it out, pull it out, smother it out, etc., sometimes those are effective for certain invasives. I've used smothering for English ivy, which I have in my yard. I've used cutting and mowing and pulling for blackberry, which is a ubiquitous weed out here in the Northwest. For lesser celandine, I don't know as much about it as I probably should. I dealt with a small infestation once, and it seemed very, very challenging. So I don't have, again, specific recommendations, but I would check with Extension and look at whatever you can find to see if there are other ways of dealing with it, before you reach for the herbicide, because maybe it can be smothered out. Maybe it can be pulled effectively if you kept at it. I'm not sure. Maybe there's somebody else in the audience who's got some experience with that particular plant. I know that I would say that if Xerces was beginning a restoration project and lesser celandine was on site, we probably would use an herbicide on it, depending upon the size and the scale of the restoration site. So.
Okay. The
Yeah.
other question I had, I think, was does the society have a political action arm?
We don't have a political action arm. No, we do some advocacy as part of our work. But within, the limitations of most of our funding, is coming from, we have a fair amount of funding that comes from individual donors, and that is unrestricted. But from most foundations, you can't use that money for things like lobbying. And we've always done, I think, the vast majority of our work through outreach and education, whether that be through, these types of events or through one-on-one interactions with farmers and homeowners and stuff like that. So a lot of our work is sort of grassroots, but we do engage in some advocacy work as well.
Great.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much. It's a wonderful organization.
Thank
Really
you so
wonderful.
much.
Thank you.
Michael Wilpers had a very insightful comment. Michael, are you willing to unmute and kind of talk about what you were saying?
Sure. It's not chemically based, which is why I held off, but I'm just wondering if there might come a day when it's a public perception question, whether people shopping at a nursery might take leaf damage as a positive sign that the plant has already proven that it can support local beneficial insects, and you don't have to wonder if it will. It's right there in front of you. Caterpillar feed, sign of insect feeding, adult or caterpillar, and that in the long future, the nursery would foreground such plants because people would be looking for a virtual guarantee that the plant is going to support insects. Any chance of public perception turning around that far in our grandchildren's lifetime?
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is definitely, there are some nurseries that really try to educate their customers about butterfly host plants. We have a really great example out here in Oregon. And I think you're right that this is, something that is important for people to recognize and for nurseries to engage in, promoting that to a certain extent. It's all about, I think, that threshold, like how many can they tolerate? Are they going to lose the whole plant? Are they going to lose the whole crop? That's where they have to make the difficult decisions. But I think for all of us, recognizing, again, going back to that whole concept of mutualism, it's not purely an aesthetic value that we are gaining from these plants. We're really looking for that ecological role that plant is going to play in our landscapes, and this is what it's going to look like sometimes, So, yeah, what we need, I think, Michael, is a campaign that somehow is, I'm not the creative type, but with a really good, it's kind of something that people can grab onto, with something that being the hook.
Maybe some really cute caterpillars.
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Sherilyn had a question about tree boring pests and how to control those. Sherilyn, are you willing to unmute and address that?
I know Dinoteferin, which is a neonic, works really well on tree boring insects. And, you're talking about some of the issues with it with pollinators. And are there any alternatives that you know of to be used in place of Dinoteferin?
Yeah. Well, for instance, I think before I came on, I was listening to people talk about elms and ash. And so like on the emerald ash borer, one of the pesticides that is registered for use is neem oil, which is also systemic, but it's not as long lasting in plant tissue as the neonics. And so it works on the emerald ash borer, but it has to be reapplied more frequently. So there are other alternatives. I think in looking at like the difficult decision, if you've got, say, emerald ash borer, which probably has already swept through your area and killed all the ash already. I'm not sure what stage of the game you're in, but I'm imagining that Maryland has already kind of dealt with like the peak of the outbreak. We're just getting it here in Oregon, by the way. And hopefully we will have learned from the East and Midwestern states' experience with emerald ash borer, because things like that are obviously just kind of in a different league and very difficult to deal with. We don't pretend to have easy answers for really any of these, but especially some of these really difficult invasives. But yes, the systemic pesticides we really designed to work on the plants that feed on the inside of, feed on the internal tissue of plants, such as borers or aphids or whiteflies or any of those kind of like xylem and phloem feeding insects. The systemic insecticides are great at dealing with those kinds of things. And there are, slightly softer. I mean, neem oil, azadirachtin can be injected. It's not quite as toxic as things like, the neonics. It's not as long-lived. If you had to make a choice, in my view, it might be the preferable choice. But you also have to be aware that if you've got something serious in your area that's going to require repeat applications, then you have to weigh, do I do a repeat application? Do I even save this tree? And so on. So again, tough decisions. It's just good to be aware of some of the different factors that are at play and some of the different options that are available.
Thank you very much.
Welcome.
We had a question earlier on in the chat from Jan Siddle, who unfortunately is no longer on, but it's a good question. For systemic pesticides, can those pesticides be transferred into seeds? And kind of what are the implications of that, if so?
Yeah, that is a good question. We know that some pesticides are transferred into seeds. We I've actually tried to look into this, and I've been surprised at how little research there is on non-food plants. That most of the data that I've found so far is on, seeds that we as humans consume as food, because those have to be tested for residue for food safety things, like a certain percentage. And a lot of that is sort of done in the lab, and then, recommendations are given on the label about how much, so that people, are not ingesting an unsafe amount. But yes, and I think one of the things when we're thinking about growing native plants from seed, or any kind of plants that we're not consuming from seed, is, would that then be a large enough quantity that once the plant grows, that we'd be concerned about the residue? And for now, acknowledging that we don't have as much data out there in studies as we'd really like, we have sort of set that concern aside because of the sort of volume, that if you're planting a seed, even if there's some residue left in it, if you're planting it in soil that isn't otherwise, holding a lot of residue, it's probably not going to be a big concern for pollinators once that plant grows and flowers. That's just a kind of very rough rule of thumb that we're kind of adopting at this point, not based on a ton of data, I will acknowledge. But because I basically think that there's probably bigger fish to fry right now. That said, though, yeah, we would hope to source even the seed that we buy neonic free.
Speaking of sourcing plants and seeds, Jill, you had a comment about big box stores versus local nurseries.
Yeah, I mentioned that, like, I never buy plants from a box store for all the reasons that we're talking about, and that they're not local natives. It's just on and on. They're cultivars. They're who knows what. So I think, as a general recommendation, and I'm a long-term Xerces Society supporter. My husband and I are. So, and we have our Xerces pollinator habitat signs or whatever, out in the yard. So we love the Xerces Society, but the Maryland Native Plant Society has a really nice, helpful map, linkable map that Prue Foster put together, and it's right on the mdflora.org. Right when you go to the website, you can scroll down a little bit, and you can actually check the map out and go to all the nurseries in our area that sell native plants. And I would recommend people ask the nursery just to be sure, ask some questions and ask them if they treat their plants with any chemicals, because most of the really good nurseries probably never do that. But, you always have to ask, because sometimes you get surprises. So that's what I wanted to recommend.
Let's go to Jora.
Hey, so I'm Jora. And I was just wondering, this is like not a very thoroughly formulated question, but this is something that I've cared about for a long time. It's a frustrating topic that can be really depressing. And I presently work at a very nice local nursery. And I'm sure that most of our stock has been treated with lots of pesticides. And, the customers are purchasing native, as close to native plants as they can get there, and wanting to support pollinators. Do you have any advice as a person who's working really hard on this topic, to help people feel positive and not hopeless about this stuff? Because even as an employee of this nursery, there's no way I could have, well, as an individual in my position, I'm not in any position where I could affect who they buy from or how they buy or anything like that. Yeah, so do you have any just advice for keeping your chin up, knowing that it's kind of rough out there and that it's imperfect?
That's such an interesting question. I've never been asked that question before.
Oh, no.
So you work at a retail nursery, you said?
Yeah.
Okay. I think that that's a great question. I mean, when you might remember that I said, you know, like, well, we used to say when the retail nursery milkweed study first came out, we were concerned at first with how people would receive that. Like, would people stop planting milkweed? Because we were finding that milkweed actually had quite a few chemicals in it. And so we tried to reinforce, look, it's still really important to be planting native plants. And we may not always know what's in the plants that we buy. And I would suggest that everyone who does care about this issue, you know, do work with the nurseries that you're buying from or working with, or, you know, use your influence and your passion in whatever effective way you can. But if you are not otherwise using pesticides on the land that you're planting these plants on, eventually what is in those plants will decline. And so if you're planting a perennial, you know, you can be confident that someday whatever is in that plant will decline. Another way that you can protect your pollinators is to remove the flowers. You can protect bees this way, at least, mostly, is to just remove the flowers for the first year or two. And then if you don't know what was in the plant, you at least have not exposed any bees. You can't do that quite so easily with caterpillars if it's like going to be used by butterfly caterpillars, because obviously remove all the leaves, the plant will probably die. So there's a limit to that kind of recommendation. And we also don't suggest like taking the soil and disposing of it. We actually probably have put that information out there, but have realized that that's not good advice because for a variety of different reasons. So I think there's so many reasons why you all, you know, working together on native plants, taking your time to come to these meetings, working in community. You know, you might remember those pictures that I had in my presentation where so many people are like getting together within their communities and organizing these planting efforts. And it's inspiring. It is, you know, it gives me hope, you know, that there are people out there taking the weekend time or evening time or time that they could be, you know, laying on the couch eating potato chips, and instead they're out there doing something good for the community. So I think that those are all the things I would point to help people feel hopeful. And, you know, any help that anybody can provide on this is always valuable. You know, I think nurseries are, you know, aware that there's consumer concern about this. And the more consumers are educated, the more consumers probe, the more consumers, you know, can work together with the nurseries in a positive way, such as through organizing these contract grows. I mean, that all helps to hopefully move the needle. So I guess that's my response, and I hope that's helpful.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Carrie, you have your hand raised.
Yeah, my comment sort of reflected the person who works at the nursery, in that I have asked nurseries and about whether neonics are used, what kind of pesticides are used on their native plants as well as their vegetable gardens and so forth for organic. They don't know. And they truly, I think, are confused. They're not just saying they don't know because they do know and they don't want to admit it. And it's rather aggravating to know that you're that powerless.
Yeah, this is something we have heard a lot for sure. And I've also experienced when I buy plants at retail. And that is another good reason, I think, to try to focus purchasing directly with those native plant nurseries that are growing what they sell. And if they have, even if they have a couple of plant sale days per year. But this is also, I mean, you all might remember, have noticed, but I talked a lot about plant buyers in this presentation, not meaning only, you know, us as home gardeners, but also plant buyers such as the plant buyers at the retail nurseries, because those plant buyers have a position of power. And I haven't talked to them as much as I've talked to the growers, but the plant buyers are usually looking for certain varieties, certain species that there's high demand for. If those plant buyers also took time to really try to understand the practices of the growers that they're sourcing from, that would make a huge difference. And so I think, like, when you go into a retail nursery and talking to the person that's at the cash register, oftentimes, yes, that experience, they don't know. It's the plant buyers who know or should know. And I think one of the effective, you know, kind of techniques is to say, well, I want to talk to a plant buyer and ask them what they know about the practices of these nurseries. They may also not know anything because they haven't asked yet, but there you have a chance to ask them to dig and find out more about the nursery practices. We have a great example of that out here in Oregon. When the whole neonic thing kind of erupted, she called all of her nurseries. She was a retail nursery, small retail nursery, and she immediately contacted all of her growers that she was sourcing from, and she asked them directly if they were using neonics. Now, it was a simpler question because she was only asking about one group of chemicals. And so she found out who was and who wasn't, and she started organizing her nursery around that. This is where you can find the neonic-free plants. She would put them in a certain section of her nursery. And so that is one way in which I think she kind of led the way and showed through example that there are ways to get this information and to then convey it to your customers through signage, you know? So these types of things can be suggested to retail nurseries. Whether they would listen or not, I don't know, but the more that people ask, the more likely they might be, you know, to follow that. But the alternative is then go directly to the native plant nurseries when they are selling directly to consumer if you can. I know it's frustrating though, because I think we've all been there. And this is not an easy nut to crack in many ways.
If I could just add a quick comment to that. Anyone who applies pesticides as a business, a farmer, a nursery manager, whatever, invasive plant control people, you are absolutely required by law to be certified, a certified pesticide applicator through whatever state you're working in. So if you are asking somebody at a nursery, don't ask the lower rung if they don't know. You go up the chain and you ask for the owner and you find out. And it doesn't matter if they want to tell you or not. They're required by law to tell you. And if they don't know, then you should call the Maryland Department of Agriculture and report them, because they absolutely have to know what they're applying. It's required by law, and it should not be even a slightly secretive thing. They should say, this is what we're applying. They should put it on signs even. And you know, you shouldn't have to be put on a runaround kind of thing where, you know, oh, I don't know. I get that from a farmer we lease a little land from, and he always goes, oh, I don't know, I've just put some stuff in a tank. And I'm like, really? Really? Really, just some stuff? So that's my point. Just, you got to follow up, and they have to tell you it is required by law. So
Do they have to tell an individual, or do they just need to tell the state? I mean, like, because they have they have to keep records, right? But do they have to tell an individual? Isn't that still discretionary, even in Maryland?
I think, I don't know if it's absolutely required by law that they tell an individual, but it would be really weird if they didn't. And if they weren't willing to tell you, you could say, well, I'm going to call the Maryland Department of Agriculture and find out, because I would really like to know what's being applied. And then they should be willing to tell you. They really shouldn't be hiding it. They should tell you. So I could be slightly off that maybe to an individual, the law doesn't say that they have to, but it certainly isn't a good business practice for them to not tell you what they're applying if it's a product you're going to be buying. It's, you know, it seems like if they're being difficult, then you should certainly not give them your business. That'd be my suggestion.
Yeah.
Kathy, Daniel, you had your hand raised?
Yeah, it was just really a anecdotal story because of the monarch butterfly story study. We were raising monarch butterflies and we were looking all over the place. I mean, it was ridiculous where we were going to find common milkweed. And finally, the caterpillars were huge. They were just eating everything that we put in there. So I went to our local nursery and I got 2 big, juicy, beautiful looking common milkweed, put 1 in each habitat. And the next morning, all 10 caterpillars were on the floor of the cage dead. So I know that the idea that the nurseries do want to sell beautiful plants that don't have any chew marks on them. And I love the guy's comment about, wouldn't it be great if people loved when they saw holes? Like when I give presentations, I say, if something isn't eating it, you got the wrong plant. There's something wrong. So it was heartbreaking to kill these 10 beautiful insects that were probably, if I hadn't fed them, if I had just said, oh, I, gave up, they probably would have formed their chrysalis that night.
Wow.
Yeah, sad.
Yeah, and we
Yes.
have heard that story again anecdotally from many people across the country, like people call us and, the same story. Yeah, that's why it is really important to try to source responsibly. And, I mean, the sense I'm getting from many of you is that you're sourcing for your own gardens, and I don't know if you can share information or if you live all over the state and in a lot of different places, but this doesn't have to be done alone. I guess I'm saying, kind of trying to get this information from nurseries and getting some sense of how they grow. And but anyway, I think the more that information can be shared, the better off for everybody. And maybe, I mean, I saw that the Maryland Native Plant Society has plant sales, and maybe those plant sales, I don't know who you're sourcing from exactly, but contract grows with them, and so that for sure that, you've got reliably safe plants. I don't know those types of mechanisms, if those would work for any subset of you, anyways, just some ideas.
And I appreciate your comment about talking to the buyer, because I brought the plants back the next day. And the person that I brought them to said, I don't know, I don't think that they're sprayed. But I was lazy and I didn't ask to talk to the buyer. So that's very good advice.
About the plant sales, Sharon, we don't run plant sales. Those are plant sales that people are putting on of native plants, and they ask us to post the information.
I see. Okay. Yeah.
We do have a couple of recommendations in the chat for nurseries who are not using these pesticides. Herring Run Nursery, Kolar Native Nursery, Chesapeake Natives, Delmarva Natives, and then in Virginia, Earthsanga and VNPS Potomac. I don't know if I pronounced that right. Apparently, these are all safe source according to the chat, although I'm not sure if that's true. I haven't vetted. Lauren, you have your hand up. You can go ahead and unmute.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I was going to just say, I'm not sure if everybody understands the sort of two-tiered thing that goes on with nurseries, but a lot of the initial growing, especially of plugs, happens at a wholesaler, or even the wholesaler might even grow to court and sell them to then a retail place. So if you go to a retail place and you ask them what they're spraying, there's a very good chance they don't know, because they haven't, it's just some person behind the counter at the checkout who's just doing the cashier thing, and they have no idea about the sourcing. There could be multiple wholesale places they're getting them from, but I think that, I think the take home here is that we all should ask and start putting a little pressure on these places to do a better job of sourcing and doing the contract growing. That's who's going to do the contract growing, because they're buying in large bulk. I'm part of some plant sales, and it's the Muddy Branch Alliance plant sale. They're a nonprofit. It's a challenge. It's actually a challenge as a small organization to host this event and find quality plants in your area that can be delivered on a certain day, that, all those like nuance of, the sizes and blah, blah, blah. So we do our best. We haven't asked these questions, and I think I will bring it up and say, hey, we should be asking this of our wholesalers. We do actually source through Pope Farm, which is the Montgomery County native plant sourcing, and I'm quite confident that they are not using all these kinds of chemicals, but I don't know about some of our other retail places. So I think it's a new, like, more nuanced thing to ask. And I think that's where the hope is, right? That's what we'll be doing now. And that's what we've all learned tonight. And we just all need to go tell everybody else to ask too. So, thank you, Sharon. This was really, really informative, to understand more about what's going on in the systemic pesticide realm, really.
Yeah. Thank you, Lauren.
Yeah.
I'm really heartened to hear that you inspired to, I mean, it is extra work, that's for sure. And so I get that, but I very much appreciate that you saying that, it is a step that you are thinking about taking or willing to take. Yeah.
It's not that different really from taking the step of going from non-native plants to native plants. That has happened. Like, we all, I don't know, I'm in this field, right? I see the shift. There are way more people asking for natives. The demand for natives is through the roof. The suppliers can't keep up. It's there. This is just the next more detailed level of how you choose your natives. I'm all about ecotype local. So yeah, I'm never buying from Home Depot or any of those places. I don't even buy most retail places. I don't buy from them. I only go to the local ecotype sources, and I grow a lot myself. So I'm kind of not the average native plant consumer, but I think that said, there are people who keep joining this movement, right? We just need to make it even better. That's really what it boils down to.
Marcia, if you want to unmute, and I think you're going to be the last question.
Okay, I just put information in the chat to add to the list of nurseries. Valley View Farms is north of Baltimore, up in the Hunt Valley area, and they're not a natives only nursery, but they do have a selection of native plants, and they actually have a pollinator protection policy that can be found on their website, and I posted the link.
I'll say I saw a note in the chat earlier that somebody asked for sources, and I can send those maybe to Judy. Some of the scientific papers that my data was based on in my presentation. So I can send that later this week to whom, I don't remember who it was that wanted that, but I'm happy to share those sources.
That would be great, Sharon.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I think there's been a lot of interest in this topic. The information you've provided, Sharon, is just great. And we really appreciate your coming and giving your talk here. We're looking forward to getting even more information from you over time. And If you think of anything else besides the sources that would make sense sharing with us, please do send them along.
Okay.
Join the Xerces Society.
Well, thank you all so much. It's really been a pleasure. What a great group of people. I really appreciate everybody who asked questions and who made this possible. It was just really nice to spend some time with all of you. I really appreciate all the efforts that all of you are making to plant native plants and do the work that you're doing. It all matters.
Well, thank you again.
Thank you.
And thank you everyone for joining us.
Mhm.